The first photo hit my phone at 7:12 p.m. on a Tuesday, right when I was standing in my kitchen trying to coax my ancient coffee maker into doing one last cycle before I had to drag myself to the night shift, and at first I genuinely thought it was some stupid family group chat meme because my cousin Derek loved spamming everybody with funny stuff that was mostly just him recycling old TikToks and acting like he'd invented humor. The notification wasn't from the family chat, though, and that was the part that made my stomach tighten before my brain even caught up, because it was from an unknown number that only said, "Is this your wife?" And then the photo loaded, bright and crisp like it had been taken with intent rather than accident, and there was Lauren, my wife of 11 years, standing in the doorway of what I recognized immediately as Derek's condo, wearing one of those soft oversized sweaters she claimed she only wore around the house when she just wanted to be comfy. Except there was nothing comfy about the way her bare legs were angled or the way Derek's hand was on her lower back like he belonged there. Like he had rights to her, like the whole world had shifted and nobody had bothered to tell me. I remember the exact noise I made, which was not a heroic noise or even a dignified one, but this thin little exhale that sounded like someone puncturing a balloon, and I remember how the kitchen light above the sink suddenly felt too bright and too cold, and I remember staring at the image long enough that my coffee maker finished wheezing out its last sputter of brown water while my hands went numb around my phone. I didn't throw anything, I didn't scream, I didn't do any of the dramatic stuff people imagine, because my body decided to go straight into this quiet, controlled shock where I could still see and hear and breathe, but I couldn't quite accept that the picture was real, even while another part of me was already replaying every odd moment of the past few months like a detective who suddenly realizes the answer was always in the room. By the time the second message came through, "Please don't tell him I texted you yet. I'm Maya. I'm Derek's girlfriend." My knees were shaking hard enough that I had to grip the counter just to stay upright, and I swear to God that in that moment, before I even typed back, I felt my marriage die with the same quiet finality as that coffee maker giving up for good. I'm Jake, I'm 38, and I live outside Richmond, Virginia in a neighborhood that looks like every other neighborhood built in the last 20 years, where the mailboxes are identical and the lawns are always slightly too green because at least one guy on the street treats fertilizer like a religion. I work nights as an operations supervisor at a UPS hub, which means my life runs on caffeine and routine and the kind of exhaustion that turns your brain into a slow, aching sponge by Friday, and Lauren works days as a dental hygienist at a practice that posts cheery Instagram reels about healthy smiles, while everyone behind the scenes is stressed and underpaid and counting the hours to the weekend. We have 2 kids, Ben who's 9 and obsessed with anything that has wheels, and Ellie who's 6 and has this maddening habit of asking deep questions right when you're trying not to cry, like she has a radar for pain and doesn't know yet that adults spend a lot of time pretending they're fine. Lauren and I weren't some perfect couple, but we were what I thought was solid, the kind of marriage built on shared grocery lists and inside jokes and that comfortable shorthand where you can communicate entire conversations with a look across a crowded room. We had our patterns, like how she'd always steal the first sip of my iced coffee when I brought it home, or how I'd always fold the towels the wrong way and she'd refold them while giving me a look that was half annoyed and half amused, and I genuinely believed we were in that stage where the chaos of young kids had settled into something manageable, where the romance would come back if we just kept showing up for each other. The initial signs of trouble weren't like a movie where she suddenly starts wearing red lipstick and coming home at midnight smelling like perfume and lies, because Lauren was more subtle than that, and honestly I wasn't looking for trouble, which is the cruel part, because when you trust someone you aren't scanning them for betrayal, you're just living your life. It started with little shifts that I chalked up to stress, like how she'd sit on the far end of the couch with her phone angled away from me, or how she'd suddenly start taking longer errands, on Saturday mornings, coming back with a couple of random items and a brightness in her face that didn't match the mundane story she was telling. She got weird about her phone in general, turning off notifications, setting it face down on every surface, taking it into the bathroom like it was a medical device keeping her alive, and when I teased her about it she'd give me this tight smile and say she was just trying to be more intentional about privacy, which sounded like something she'd read on a wellness blog and wanted to pretend was her idea. Derek was part of our lives the way certain relatives are, always orbiting, always loud, always present at family cookouts and birthdays and random Sunday gatherings, and he had this charm that a lot of people fell for because it came packaged with confidence and jokes and a grin that made you feel like you were in on something. He's my cousin on my mom's side, 2 years younger than me, and growing up he was the kid who could talk his way out of anything, while I was the kid who followed the rules and tried to be reliable. Even as adults, he kept that same energy, bouncing from job to job, always chasing the next big thing, and lately that big thing was real estate, which meant his social media was a constant parade of staged smiles, open houses, motivational quotes, and pictures of him holding keys like he was handing out dreams. For a while I thought Lauren just found him amusing in that family clown way, because she'd laugh at his stories and sometimes roll her eyes at his ego, and that felt normal. Then it started changing, and I didn't see it clearly at the time, but looking back it's like the difference between a lamp turned low and a lamp suddenly turned off, because she began watching him in a way that wasn't about humor anymore, in a way that had a little charge to it, like she was listening for something specific in his voice. At Thanksgiving, I remember catching a moment where Derek leaned close to her while everyone else was talking, and Lauren's face did this soft thing, this private smile that wasn't meant for the room, and I told myself I was imagining it, because the alternative would have required me to accept something ugly. The worst part is that Derek's girlfriend, Maya, was becoming part of the family too, and she was genuinely likable in a way that made you want to root for her. She's 29, she bartends at this place downtown with string lights and overpriced cocktails, and she's in nursing school, which means she's always balancing schedules and studying and still showing up to family events with a tray of deviled eggs like she's trying to prove she belongs. She has this sharp, observant calm about her, like she's used to dealing with drunk people and sick people and she's learned how to read a room before it gets out of hand, and I realize now that she was reading my marriage long before I had the courage to. If you're wondering how I didn't catch it sooner, trust me, I've asked myself the same question at 3 a.m. while staring at the ceiling and feeling like the dumbest man alive, and the answer is that betrayal rarely announces itself, it slips in through the cracks of routine. Lauren and I had opposite schedules, and on nights I worked, she was home with the kids, and on mornings she worked, I was the one doing breakfast and backpacks and trying to remember which kid had library day, and there was so much logistical noise that it was easy for her to hide in the gaps. She didn't need to disappear for hours, she just needed to redirect a few minutes here and there, a quick stop after work, a late patient that turned into another 30 minutes, a girls' night that didn't include any girls I ever met. The first hard evidence didn't come from me spying or digging, which I almost wish it had because then at least I could pretend I was some brilliant investigator, but it came from Maya, and it came because she was hurting enough to stop being polite. When I got that first text, "Is this your wife?" I was so stunned that I just stared at it like maybe my eyes would rearrange the pixels into something else, and then I tapped the photo again, zooming in until I could see the familiar tiny freckle under Lauren's left eye, the one I used to kiss when she was laughing, and I could see the blurred background of Derek's condo, the ugly little piece of wall art he'd bought at Target that said, "Hustle," and I could see Derek's reflection in the hallway mirror, smiling like he'd won. I typed back with hands that didn't feel like mine, asking who this was, what the hell was happening, and Maya responded with a string of messages that felt like someone pulling a thread until the whole sweater unraveled. She told me she'd been suspicious for weeks, because Derek had gotten protective of his phone and weird about his schedule, because he'd started showering the second he came home like he was washing off someone else's perfume, because he'd suddenly started networking more and needing to meet clients at odd hours. She said she brushed it off until she noticed Lauren's car parked 2 blocks away from Derek's condo on a night Derek claimed he was home alone working on listings, and she only noticed because Maya drives past that street on her way to class and her brain did what brains do when something doesn't match the story. Maya told me she didn't confront either of them right away, because she wanted to be sure and because she didn't want to be the crazy girlfriend accusing a man who would inevitably call her paranoid, so she waited and watched, and then she did something I still don't know whether to admire or fear, because she set a trap that required patience. She borrowed Derek's old iPad from the closet, the one he claimed he never used anymore, and she charged it up and found out it was still connected to his Apple ID, still syncing messages if the device was on Wi-Fi, and she said she didn't even mean to see what she saw at first, because it started with a notification that popped up while she was just trying to check the battery settings. The notification was from Lauren, and it wasn't subtle, and it wasn't friendly, and it wasn't something you could explain away with family jokes, because it said, "I can still taste you." When Maya told me that line, I felt my throat close, like my body was trying to reject oxygen, and I remember walking from the kitchen to the living room without meaning to, my feet moving on autopilot, and the kids were sprawled on the carpet watching some cartoon with bright colors and cheap jokes, and Lauren's cardigan was hanging on the back of the chair like a perfectly normal piece of fabric. And the contrast between that domestic scene and the words I just read made me feel like I was losing my mind. Maya sent more, and each message hit like a punch you don't see coming because you still can't accept the fight is real. She had screenshots of Lauren and Derek arranging times, making excuses, talking about me like I was an obstacle rather than a person, and the part that lodged in my ribs was how casual Lauren sounded, how practiced, like she'd been doing it long enough that guilt had turned into routine. The texts weren't romantic in a sweet way, they were hungry and selfish and full of that private shorthand that people build when they think they're safe, and I realized with this cold clarity that while I was packing lunches and making dentist appointments for the kids and trying to keep my marriage alive by being steady, Lauren had been building a second life in the shadows. I asked Maya why she was sending this to me instead of confronting Derek, and her response came after a long pause, like she was staring at her own ceiling deciding whether to jump. She said, "Because if I go to him first, he'll talk his way out of it, and if he talks his way out of it, I'll want to believe him, and if I believe him, I'll hate myself, so I need you to know too, because then it's real." There was something about that honesty that cracked me open, because it wasn't just anger, it was fear of being manipulated, and it made me realize that Derek wasn't just cheating, he was likely running the same playbook on both of us, counting on our attachment to make us doubt our own eyes. The last piece of evidence Maya sent was the one that made my vision blur, because it was a photo of Lauren's hand on Derek's thigh taken in Derek's car, and on Lauren's ring finger was nothing, the pale line of skin where her wedding ring should have been, and I thought about how she told me 2 weeks ago that her ring felt tight, and she didn't want to lose it while washing dishes, and I'd believed her like an idiot, and now I saw the truth, which was that she was taking it off because she didn't want the world to see she belonged to someone else. I didn't confront Lauren right away, and I know some people will read that and think it means I'm weak, but it was more complicated than that, because when your life explodes you don't instantly become a decisive action hero, you become a person trying to keep their hands from shaking while the floor drops out. I told Maya I needed a few hours to process, and she said she understood, but then she added, "Jake, please don't give her time to spin it, because she will," and the certainty in her words made me feel even sicker, because it meant Maya had already watched Derek try to rewrite reality. Lauren got home around 8:30, carrying takeout like it was any other Tuesday, smiling at the kids, kissing Ellie's forehead, asking Ben about his homework, and there was something so surreal about her being kind while my phone was full of proof that she'd been unkind in the worst way. She looked at me and asked why I seemed off, and I could feel my body trying to pretend, trying to keep the peace because the kids were right there, and I almost managed it. I almost let another night pass, until she put her phone on the counter and a notification lit up the screen and I saw Derek's name flash, and the rage that had been simmering turned into something hot and urgent. I told the kids to go brush their teeth and pick out pajamas, and they groaned like kids do, and Lauren rolled her eyes like a mom who's used to bedtime battles, and as soon as they disappeared down the hall, I stepped closer to her, close enough that I could smell her shampoo, and I said her name in a voice that didn't sound like mine. She asked what was wrong, and I watched her face carefully, and the way her eyes darted, just a fraction too fast toward her phone, told me she already knew, or at least she suspected. I said, as calmly as I could manage, that I'd received some messages, and her expression tightened in that way people do when they're bracing for impact while still trying to appear in control. She asked from who, and I told her Maya, and I watched the blood drain from Lauren's face so fast it was almost impressive, because that reaction was not a reaction you have to innocent information. For a second, she tried to play confused, saying she didn't know what Maya would be messaging me about, and I let the silence stretch, because silence is a blade when someone is lying. Then I pulled out my phone and held it up, and I didn't even have to say much, because the photos did the talking, and her eyes fixed on the screen like she was watching her own funeral. Lauren's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and then the first words out of her mouth were so cliché that I almost laughed, except there was nothing funny in me anymore, because she said, "Jake, it's not what you think, you're taking it out of context," and the anger in my chest surged so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. I told her there was no context on earth where her standing in Derek's doorway with his hand on her back was anything other than betrayal, and I told her I'd seen the texts, and I watched her flinch at that, because it meant she couldn't pretend it was a misunderstanding. She started crying, but it wasn't the pure kind of crying you do when you're grieving. It was frantic, defensive crying, the kind that tries to make the other person soften, and she kept saying she was lonely, that my night shifts made her feel like a single parent, that Derek just listened, that it started as talking, and she said it in this rush like she was dumping excuses on the table hoping one of them would stick. When I asked her how long, she tried to dodge, saying it was complicated, and when I pressed again, she finally whispered, since late summer, which meant months, which meant all those nights I'd been kissing her cheek and thinking we were just tired were nights she'd been living a lie. I asked her if she loved him, and she said she didn't know, and that answer somehow hurt worse than a yes, because it meant I wasn't even worth the dignity of clarity. The moment that broke whatever restraint I had left was when she said, "He's your cousin, Jake." It didn't mean anything serious, like the fact that it was family made it less horrifying, like betrayal within bloodlines was somehow safer. I told her that was the sickest logic I'd ever heard, and I asked her if she'd thought about our kids, and she started sobbing harder and said, "I wasn't trying to hurt them," and I remember leaning on the counter because my legs felt like they were made of wet sand, and I said, "But you were willing to hurt me," and she looked at me with this panic like she was just now realizing I wasn't going to absorb it and keep the household standing the way I always did. Then she did the thing I didn't expect, the thing that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it, because she stopped crying long enough to look me in the eye and say, "Please don't tell anyone in the family, because Derek will be destroyed," and the way she said it, protective, urgent, made something inside me go cold, because it wasn't just that she'd cheated, it was that in the moment where my world was ending, her instinct was to protect him, not me. People talk about anger like it's the main emotion in situations like this, like you find out and you rage and you smash things and you storm out, and sure, anger was there, loud and sharp, but underneath it was this grief that felt like swallowing glass. I'd built my adult life around the idea that Lauren and I were a team, that even when things were hard we were facing the same direction, and finding out she'd turned away from me in secret felt like realizing your own home has been moving without you, like the walls have been rearranging themselves while you sleep. That night after the confrontation, I went into the garage and sat in the driver's seat of my car with the door closed, because it was the only place I could be alone without the kids hearing, and I stared at the steering wheel while my hands shook so badly I couldn't even grip it. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't, because screaming would mean making it real, and I wasn't ready for real, not when Ben still thought his biggest problem was a math test and Ellie still believed parents were permanent. Lauren knocked on the garage door once, softly, and asked if I was coming back inside, and I didn't answer, not because I wanted to be cruel but because I couldn't trust my voice not to crack open and spill everything. After a while she went away, and I sat there long enough that the air got stale and my head started to ache, and I remember thinking about every family event, every Christmas photo, every trip to the beach where Derek had been there, and I felt contaminated, like my memories were ruined by the knowledge that even then, they might have been looking at each other while I wasn't watching. The shock gave way to this nauseating loop of questions that had no satisfying answers, because my brain kept trying to solve it like a math problem, like if I could find the exact moment it started then I could fix something, or at least understand it, but betrayal doesn't work like that. I kept replaying conversations where Lauren told me she loved me, and I believed her, and now those words felt like counterfeit money, pretty but worthless. I kept thinking about Derek's grin at the last cookout, the way he'd clapped me on the back and called me brother, and I realized he'd been doing that while sleeping with my wife, and the humiliation of that made my skin prickle, because it wasn't just pain, it was being made a fool in my own family. The sadness hid in small, ridiculous ways, like when I opened the fridge later and saw the magnetic photo strip from a photo booth Lauren and I did years ago at the state fair, our faces pressed together, laughing like idiots, and I actually had to close the fridge because tears came so fast I couldn't breathe. I wasn't just losing a marriage, I was losing the version of my life where I thought I was safe, where I thought love was something you could trust if you did the work, and the worst part was realizing how naive that sounded in my own head. And then there was the self-blame, because even when you know cheating is a choice, your mind still goes hunting for what you did wrong, because blaming yourself gives you the illusion of control, like if you caused it then you could have prevented it. I thought about my night shifts, about the times I came home too tired to talk, about the evenings I fell asleep on the couch while Lauren watched her shows alone, and I felt this ugly guilt, even while another part of me wanted to grab that guilt by the throat and shake it, because plenty of couples deal with stress without sleeping with family members. Somewhere around 2 a.m. I checked my phone again and saw Maya had sent one more message, and it was simple, which somehow made it heavier, because it said, "I'm sorry. I know you didn't ask for this. I'm here if you want to talk." I stared at that for a long time, and then I typed back something like, "Thank you. I don't even know what to do," and she replied almost immediately, like she'd been sitting with her own grief waiting for company, and she said, "I know exactly what to do, but we have to do it smart." The next morning, Lauren acted like a woman trying to hold a vase together with shaking hands, moving carefully, speaking softly, making the kids' breakfast like routine could undo what she'd done, and she kept shooting me these pleading looks like if she could just get me alone long enough she could talk her way back into safety. I kept my face neutral because the kids were there, because I refused to let the first day of their new reality begin with a screaming match over cereal, and I went through the motions of the morning like a ghost performing tasks out of habit. When Lauren finally cornered me in the hallway and whispered that we needed to talk, I told her we already had, and I said it in this flat voice that surprised even me, because the rage had burned out into something colder, something steadier. She started crying again and said she'd end it, she'd block Derek, she'd do therapy, she'd do anything, and the word anything hung there like bait, and part of me wanted to grab it, because the idea of not destroying my family was still seductive, but then I remembered her instinct to protect Derek, and I remembered the months of lies, and I realized that whatever she was offering wasn't love, it was damage control. I told her I needed space, and she asked if I was going to leave, and I said no, because I wasn't abandoning my kids, and she flinched at the way I said my kids like I'd already separated us. She tried to touch my arm, and I stepped back, and the look on her face was this mix of fear and disbelief, like she truly believed I would just absorb this the way I absorb everything else in our life, quietly and dutifully. That afternoon, while the kids were at school, I drove to a park and sat in my car again, because my brain needed quiet, and I called Maya, and when she picked up, her voice sounded tired in the way people sound when they've been crying on and off for days. We talked for almost an hour, and it wasn't a dramatic conversation with big speeches, it was two betrayed people comparing notes, filling in the missing pieces, and every time she confirmed another detail, another day Derek lied, another time Lauren disappeared, it felt like putting nails in the coffin of my marriage. Maya told me she'd confronted Derek once already, lightly, testing him, and he'd laughed and called her insecure and then turned it around on her, accusing her of not supporting his career, and she said the speed with which he flipped the blame made her realize he wasn't just cheating, he was prepared to gaslight her into oblivion. She said she didn't want to explode and storm out with nothing but anger, because Derek would spin a story to the family and make her look unstable, and she didn't want that, not because she cared what they thought, but because she didn't want him controlling the narrative the way he'd controlled everything else. Then Maya said the word that made my pulse spike, because she said, "We can make them feel it," and she said it quietly, not like a villain, but like someone who's finally done being played. She clarified immediately that she didn't mean violence, she didn't mean breaking things or doing anything illegal, and the fact that she even said that out loud told me she was thinking clearly, thinking strategically, which was more than I could say for myself at that moment. She meant consequences, exposure, timing, truth delivered in a way they couldn't wriggle out of, and she said, if we do this right, they won't get to rewrite it, they won't get to make us the bad guys, and they won't get to keep their comfort while we pick up the ashes. I asked her what she had in mind, and she told me she'd already started gathering screenshots, time stamps, location history, everything that showed a pattern, because she knew Derek would deny, and she suspected Lauren would minimize, and she wanted proof that couldn't be argued away. I told her I had kids, and she said she understood, and that we'd keep the kids out of it as much as possible, because revenge that hurts children isn't revenge, it's cruelty, and hearing her say that made something in me loosen, because it reminded me I wasn't the only one trying to be decent while bleeding. When we hung up, I sat there in the parked car with my forehead against the steering wheel, and I realized I'd crossed a line inside myself, because I was no longer thinking, how do I save this? And I was thinking, how do I survive it without letting them walk away clean? I still loved the idea of my marriage, I still loved the memory of Lauren, but the woman who lived in my house had made choices that were now part of our story forever, and I could either let her and Derek steer that story, or I could take the wheel back. And as I drove home, with the winter sun low over the neighborhood and my phone buzzing with a new message from Maya that just said, I have a plan. We need to talk tonight, I realized that the calm I felt wasn't forgiveness, it was preparation, and the version of me who believed in quiet loyalty was about to meet the version of me who finally understood that sometimes the only way to heal is to stop protecting the people who cut you open. When I pulled into my driveway that evening, the porch light was on even though it wasn't fully dark yet, and for a second the normalcy of it almost tricked my brain into thinking I could walk inside and everything would be fine, because the house looked the same, the kids' bikes were still tipped over in the yard, and the wreath Lauren insisted on hanging every winter was still crooked on the door. But the second I stepped out of the car and felt my phone buzz again with Maya's message, that illusion shattered so fast it felt like glass in my throat. Lauren met me at the door like she'd been standing there waiting, her face puffy from crying but her posture strangely rehearsed, and she asked if we could talk like adults, which was a phrase she'd never used before unless she was trying to sound reasonable while steering the outcome, and I just remember thinking that she'd spent months talking like a teenager sneaking around behind my back. And now she wanted to borrow adulthood as a costume because she'd finally been caught. I told her we could talk after the kids were asleep, and she tried to insist, right there, right now, like she was scared that if she let the night pass I'd harden into something she couldn't bend, and she wasn't wrong, because every hour that went by without me collapsing into forgiveness was another hour she couldn't control. The kids barreled into the hallway, Ellie tugging my sleeve and Ben talking a mile a minute about a toy he wanted, and I felt that familiar parental reflex kick in, the one that says you keep your voice gentle even when your heart is coming apart, so I smiled at them and asked about their day and listened like I wasn't holding a bomb behind my ribs, and Lauren watched me with this strange mix of shame and irritation, as if my ability to still be a father in the middle of her disaster was somehow making her feel worse. That night, after bedtime stories and teeth brushing and the usual bargaining about one more glass of water, I went into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed like a man waiting to be sentenced, and Lauren followed me in slowly, perching on the far corner with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She started with apologies, lots of them, the kind that sounded heartfelt if you didn't know they were layered over a foundation of deception, and she kept saying she was so sorry, and she'd made a mistake, and every time she said mistake my stomach clenched because mistakes are leaving milk out overnight, mistakes are forgetting an appointment. Mistakes are not months of calculated betrayal with my cousin while kissing me goodnight and helping our kids glue macaroni onto construction paper. Hearts. I asked her one question I'd been holding all day, because I needed to hear it even though I knew it would hurt, and I asked her if Derek had been in our house, in our bed, in the spaces where our children played, and she hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words, because an innocent person would have snapped out a horrified no. But she swallowed and whispered that, it happened once, when I was on a double shift and she'd been lonely, and my vision tunneled so hard I had to grip the mattress to keep from swaying. She started crying again and tried to reach for my hand, and I yanked it away like her touch was a burn, and she kept saying she didn't know why she did it, she didn't know what came over her, she felt so disconnected, and I realized she was trying to build a narrative where she was a victim of emotions rather than the author of choices. I told her I'd already spoken to Maya, and the second I said that, Lauren's tears changed, because now they weren't just tears of guilt, they were tears of fear, and she asked what Maya told me, and her voice had this sharp edge like she was calculating damage. I told her I wasn't going to play 20 questions, that I knew enough, and I said something that surprised me because it came out calm and cold, which was that I was done protecting Derek, done protecting her, and done protecting the version of our marriage that only existed in my head. Lauren's head snapped up and she said, "You can't blow up the family over this," and there it was, the audacity of it, because she'd already thrown the grenade and now she wanted me to be the one to gently put the pin back in. She begged me not to tell anyone, and she said it would humiliate her, and she said the kids would be scarred, and she said Derek's mom, my aunt, would have a heart attack, and she said my mom would never forgive her, and she talked like the consequences were this tragic storm that would hit innocent people, never once pausing to acknowledge that she and Derek had chosen those consequences the second they decided to do what they did. When I told her I was calling a lawyer, she actually got angry, like real anger, like I'd wronged her, and she said, "So you're just throwing away 11 years, and I stared at her and said, "You threw it away in late summer, I'm just finding out about it now," and she looked at me like she couldn't believe I wasn't bargaining. That was the moment I made my decision, even if it didn't feel like a cinematic turning point, because it was less about drama and more about clarity, because I finally understood that staying with her wouldn't be forgiveness, it would be self-abandonment, and I had spent too many years being the steady one to now become the doormat. I told her I wanted her out of the bedroom, and she said where would she go, and I said the guest room, and she said she didn't want to sleep like strangers, and I told her we were strangers, because I didn't know the woman who could look at our kids and then go meet Derek behind my back. After she left the room, I sat there in the dark with my phone glowing in my hand, and I called Maya, and she answered immediately like she'd been waiting in her own darkness for the same lifeline. Her voice was steady, but I could hear that tremor underneath, the part of her that was furious and heartbroken and still trying to keep it together, and I told her I was filing, I was done, and she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath all day. Then she said, "Okay, then we do this the right way, and we do it in a way that leaves them nowhere to hide," and there was something about her phrasing, "the right way," that made me trust her, because she wasn't talking about slashing tires or screaming in a parking lot, she was talking about strategy, truth, and consequences. Maya laid out her plan like she'd been building it in her head for weeks, and it wasn't one grand revenge stunt, it was a sequence of moves that would force Derek and Lauren to face what they'd done without us becoming the villains in their rewritten story. She told me to get a lawyer first, because legal clarity was armor, and she told me to gather every piece of financial information I could, accounts, credit cards, mortgage details, because cheaters don't just lie about sex, they lie about money, and she said the first thing Derek did when she confronted him lightly was try to make her feel crazy, which meant his next move would be to scramble and control the narrative, and she suspected Lauren would follow suit the moment she realized I wasn't folding. She told me she had screenshots, but she also had location history and timestamps, and she had enough to prove it wasn't a misunderstanding or a drunken slip, and she said, "We don't have to destroy them with rumors, we destroy them with reality," and I remember staring at the ceiling while she spoke, feeling like I was listening to someone explain how to survive a shipwreck. Then she said the part that made my pulse spike, because she said she wanted to tell the family together, in person, in a controlled setting, because if we didn't, Derek would get ahead of it and paint Maya as unstable and me as an overworked husband who neglected his wife, and once those stories took root, they would be harder to uproot than any screenshot. I asked her if she was sure she could handle that, because family blow-ups are brutal even when you're not blood-related, and she said she was done being polite, done being the girlfriend who smiles at cookouts while her boyfriend is sleeping with someone else, and she said, "I want them to look at us when we say it, because I want them to see the damage, and I want them to realize this isn't drama, it's cruelty." I could hear her swallowing emotion, and I realized we were both running on the same fuel now, this strange combination of pain and resolve. The next morning, I called in sick, which is something I almost never do because I'm the guy who shows up even when he's exhausted, and my supervisor sounded surprised but didn't push, and I wondered if my voice had something hollow in it that made him back off. Lauren left for work like a ghost trying to pretend she was still alive, and the second she was gone, I did what Maya said, because at that point the only thing keeping me upright was action. I pulled up every bank statement and credit card statement, and I printed what I could, and I changed passwords to things tied to my name, because I wasn't about to get blindsided by a frantic cheater trying to rewrite the financial landscape. I checked our joint account and felt another wave of nausea when I saw a handful of unfamiliar charges, gas stations near Derek's place, a couple of restaurant tabs that weren't our usual spots, small amounts, but enough to tell me they'd been using our shared life to fund their secret life, and that detail lit a new kind of rage in me, because it was one thing to destroy my trust, but it was another to do it with my money. I scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney recommended by a guy at work who'd been through a messy split, and sitting in that law office later that day felt like stepping into a sterile alternate universe where my marriage was just a case file, but the attorney's calm was grounding, because she spoke in facts and options rather than emotions, and she told me what I already knew in my gut, which was that I needed to document everything, keep communication in writing, prioritize the kids, and not get baited into anything that could be used against me. When she said the phrase, best interests of the children, I almost broke, because it made the whole thing feel so real, like my kids' lives were about to be divided into schedules and holidays and court language. That night, I told Maya I'd met with the lawyer, and she told me she'd done the same, because she wasn't playing around either, and then we did the thing that felt both strange and necessary, which was meeting in person for the first time since this all exploded, because texting and calls can only carry so much. We met at a quiet coffee shop in the middle of town, one of those places with mismatched chairs and soft indie music, and the moment I saw her walk in with her hair pulled back and her eyes rimmed red like she hadn't slept, I felt this weird rush of solidarity, because she was living the same nightmare from a different angle. We sat in a corner and compared notes like we were building a case, and the more we spoke, the more the pattern snapped into focus, because Derek had been telling Maya he was meeting clients on nights he was with Lauren, and Lauren had been telling me she was running errands on mornings she was with Derek, and it was like watching two puzzle pieces click together into something ugly. Maya showed me a timeline she'd typed out, dates and times and screenshots, and it was so organized it was almost chilling, and I realized she'd been holding herself together by turning heartbreak into evidence. I told her about the time Lauren claimed her ring felt tight, and Maya nodded like she'd expected it, and she said Derek would take off his watch when he met Lauren because he didn't want tan lines or marks, which was such a stupid, selfish detail that it made me laugh bitterly, because cheaters are always so careful about the wrong things. Then Maya leaned forward and said, "Okay, so here's what we do, and we do it with our heads, not just our hearts," and she laid it out in a way that felt almost clinical, except her hands were shaking slightly around her coffee cup, which told me the anger was still there underneath the strategy. Step 1 was legal and financial protection, which we were already doing, because revenge without stability is just chaos. Step 2 was controlling the narrative by telling the family ourselves, but doing it in a way that didn't look like we were staging a spectacle, because we weren't trying to entertain anyone, we were trying to prevent lies from taking over. Step 3 was giving Derek and Lauren enough rope to hang themselves socially, not by trickery, but by refusing to cover for them when questions started, and by letting their own contradictions expose them. We chose a date because timing mattered, and that part felt surreal, like scheduling the collapse of your life on a calendar, but the date we picked made sense because it was the annual holiday get-together at my aunt's house, the one everyone attended because my aunt treated hosting like a competitive sport. It was supposed to be this warm family night with too much food and loud conversation, and I remember thinking how ironic it was that the same house where we'd taken happy photos would now become the place where truth detonated. Maya said she wanted to be there, because she wanted to see Derek's face when he realized she wasn't going to quietly disappear, and I told her I wanted to be there because I was done being the guy who smiles while being stabbed. The week leading up to it was the hardest stretch of my life, because I had to live in the same house as Lauren while pretending to the kids that everything was normal, and Lauren swung between sobbing apologies and sharp defensiveness like a pendulum, sometimes begging me to just try counseling, sometimes accusing me of teaming up with Maya like I was doing something immoral by speaking to another betrayed person. One night she cornered me in the kitchen and said, "So you're really going to ruin me?" And I remember staring at her and realizing she still didn't understand, because she saw consequences as something being inflicted on her rather than something she'd created, and I told her, "I'm not ruining you, Lauren, I'm refusing to lie for you," and she looked at me like I'd slapped her. Meanwhile, Derek started texting me like everything was fine, sending me dumb memes and asking if I was coming to the holiday thing, and the sheer nerve of it made my hands shake with fury, because he was walking around like he hadn't been in my bed, like he hadn't betrayed me with a grin. Maya warned me not to respond, because silence was safer, but I did one thing, one small thing, because I wanted a record, and I texted him, "We need to talk after the family party," and he responded with, "For sure bro, everything good," and that casual, bro, was like acid. The night of the holiday get-together arrived with freezing rain that turned the sidewalk slick, and I remember driving there with the kids strapped into their seats, Lauren in the passenger seat rigid and pale, and my stomach churning so hard I thought I might throw up in the car. Maya drove separately, because she didn't want Derek seeing her with me beforehand, and when we pulled up, my aunt's house glowed with warm lights and holiday decorations like a postcard, and the normalcy of it felt almost offensive. Inside, people were laughing, kids were running around, my mom was in the kitchen helping my aunt, and Derek was there, of course, in a holiday sweater that made him look harmless, which was almost funny in the darkest way. Derek saw me and grinned, clapping me on the shoulder like we were still family in the way that mattered, and my body went stiff with the urge to punch him, but I didn't, because I had 2 kids watching and I wasn't giving him the satisfaction of making me look unhinged. Lauren hovered near me like she was terrified I'd explode, and every so often she'd glance toward Derek with this flicker of something, fear, guilt, longing, I don't even know, and that glance alone made my blood boil. I kept my focus on my kids, helping them navigate the snack table, talking to relatives, pretending I wasn't seconds away from tearing the entire room apart with truth. Maya arrived about 30 minutes in, and I saw Derek's face shift the second he spotted her, because his grin faltered, and his eyes narrowed like he was trying to calculate why she looked so calm. Maya walked in like she belonged there, which she did, because she'd been part of this circle for months, and she greeted people politely, even smiled at my aunt, and then she caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod that said, "Now." That nod steadied me, because it reminded me this wasn't just me flailing in pain, this was 2 people refusing to be erased. We waited until the kids were distracted with cousins and desserts, and then Maya and I approached my aunt and my mom first, because they were the anchors of the family, the ones who would set the emotional tone, and I didn't want Derek controlling that moment. I asked my mom if we could talk somewhere quieter, and she looked concerned because moms always know when something is wrong, and she led us into the den where the noise was muffled. My aunt followed, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she joked about us looking so serious, and then she saw my face and her smile faded. I told them, plainly, that Lauren and Derek had been having an affair, and I said it without shouting, because I wanted my words to land like facts rather than drama, and the second the sentence left my mouth, the room went silent in a way that felt unreal. My mom's hand flew to her mouth, and my aunt's eyes widened like she'd misheard, and for a split second I saw them both try to reject it, because family betrayal is the kind of thing people want to believe only happens to strangers. Then Maya stepped forward and said, softly but firmly, that she was Derek's girlfriend and she had proof, and she wasn't saying it out of jealousy, she was saying it because it was true. My aunt demanded what kind of proof, and Maya pulled out her phone and showed a few screenshots, not the explicit ones, not the ones that would be cruel, but enough, names, dates, messages, to make denial impossible. My mom started crying immediately, the kind of crying that comes from shock and heartbreak and anger all tangled together, and my aunt turned pale and sat down hard on the couch. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them, because I was detonating their family illusion too, but then I remembered that Lauren had asked me to keep quiet to protect Derek, and I reminded myself that truth isn't cruelty, it's oxygen. My aunt said Derek would never do that, and then she said Lauren would never do that, and then she looked at me like she was searching for the punchline, and I told her I wished I was lying, and I said I'd already spoken to a lawyer, and that I was filing for divorce, and Maya said she was leaving Derek, and suddenly it wasn't just an accusation, it was a reality with decisions attached. My mom wiped her face and said we needed to tell the rest of the adults, because the longer we waited, the more time Derek and Lauren had to twist the story, and I nodded even though my throat felt like it was closing. We walked back into the main room, and my aunt called out for everyone to gather, her voice shaking, and people turned with confused smiles that faded as they saw her face. Derek immediately straightened like he knew something was coming, and Lauren froze like a deer in headlights, and I watched Derek's gaze flick to Lauren for half a second, a silent communication that made my skin crawl. My aunt said, loud enough for the adults to hear but not so loud that the kids would immediately understand, that there was a serious family matter, and then she looked at Derek with something like disbelief and said, "Is it true?" and the room became this charged, suspended space. Derek did what Derek always did, which was try to charm his way out, and he laughed nervously and said people were overreacting, and he tried to frame it like some misunderstanding, and then he looked at me and said, "Jake, come on man, talk to me," like we were buddies in a dispute about a borrowed tool rather than a marriage. I said, in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, that I had seen the messages and the evidence, and that Maya had evidence too, and that he could deny it all he wanted but it was real. Lauren started crying, and she said my name in that pleading tone, and I didn't look at her because I couldn't stand the sight of her performing pain now after months of hiding it. Maya stepped forward and spoke directly to Derek, her voice trembling with fury, and she said, "You don't get to gaslight your way out of this, Derek, because I have the screenshots, I have the timeline, and I have the location history, and you can try to laugh, but you did this, and you're not going to make me feel crazy anymore." Derek's face flushed, and he tried to snap back, accusing her of invading his privacy, because cheaters love to act like the real crime is getting caught, and Maya shot back, "My privacy ended the moment you brought another woman into our bed," and the room erupted with murmurs and sharp inhales. My aunt turned to Lauren, her eyes wide with betrayal, and she asked Lauren if it was true, and Lauren tried to speak but all that came out were broken sobs, and then she whispered, "I'm sorry," and that was it, that was the confirmation, and the room shifted, because once the truth is admitted, it can't be shoved back into a lie. My mom let out this sound halfway between a sob and a growl, and she looked at Lauren like she didn't recognize her, and she said, "In my house, with my grandchildren, you did this," and Lauren collapsed into tears like she wanted the room to pity her, but the pity wasn't there, because betrayal doesn't earn pity when it's that calculated. The fallout was immediate and messy, not in a violent way, but in the way family fallout always is, with people talking over each other, relatives demanding explanations, Derek trying to spin stories, Lauren trying to cling to me as if proximity could salvage anything, and Maya standing there like a lighthouse in a storm, shaking but unmovable. The kids sensed something wrong and started drifting closer, and I hated that their innocent night was being poisoned by adult ugliness, so I scooped Ellie into my arms and told Ben we were leaving, and I did it gently but firmly, and I told them there was grown-up stuff happening and we'd talk later, and Ben's eyes were huge because he knew that tone meant something serious. Lauren tried to follow us out, and I turned to her in the entryway where the coats were piled and the air smelled like cinnamon and wet wool, and I said, quietly but with enough force that she flinched, that we were not having this conversation in front of the kids, and that she could come home later after I'd gotten them settled, because I needed space. She begged me not to do this, she begged me not to file, she begged me not to let Maya control me, and I remember looking at her and realizing she still couldn't stand the idea that I was making my own choices, because she'd been treating me like a prop in her story, the reliable husband who would keep the lights on while she chased thrills. I told her, the only person who controlled this was you, when you chose him, and I walked out with my kids while behind me the family's holiday lights flickered like nothing had happened. The next few weeks were brutal in a way that's hard to describe without sounding melodramatic, because it wasn't one big moment anymore, it was the slow grind of consequences, paperwork, conversations, and grief. Lauren moved into the guest room at first, but after the family blow-up, she couldn't handle the tension, and she started staying with a friend, which she framed as me kicking her out, even though I never told her she couldn't be near the kids, I just told her I wasn't sharing a bed with her again. Derek tried to call me multiple times, leaving voicemails that swung between apologizing and blaming me for bringing Maya into it, as if Maya was some weapon I'd invented rather than a person he'd betrayed, and I didn't respond, because my lawyer told me to keep communication minimal and in writing. Maya and I kept talking, not in a romantic way, not in a let's bond over trauma, cliché way, but in a survival way, because sometimes the only people who understand your pain are the ones standing in the same fire. She told me Derek was spiraling, posting weird motivational stuff online like, never let haters dim your shine, which was almost comical until you remembered he'd destroyed multiple lives and was still trying to brand himself as the victim. She said he showed up at her apartment one night banging on the door, crying and raging, accusing her of ruining him, and she called the police not because she wanted drama, but because she needed him to leave and she needed a record, and hearing that made me feel sick and relieved at the same time, because it confirmed what I'd suspected, which was that Derek's charm had always been a mask for entitlement, and once the mask cracked, there was something ugly underneath. Lauren's life started unraveling in a way that felt both inevitable and surreal, because consequences don't always come in lightning bolts, sometimes they come in a slow, humiliating drip. The dental practice she worked at was owned by a husband and wife team who were deeply involved in the same community as my family, and once the affair became family knowledge, it seeped outward the way gossip always does in small circles, and Lauren started getting icy looks at work. Then her hours got cut because of scheduling, and then, a month later, she told me through clenched teeth that she was taking a break, because the environment had become hostile, and I knew what that meant. Even if she wouldn't say it, she had become radioactive, and the people around her didn't trust her. Derek's fallout was louder, because he couldn't hide in shame the way Lauren tried to, and he tried to salvage his image by telling anyone who would listen that it was a mistake and that Jake and Lauren were basically separated, which was a lie so bold it would have been impressive if it hadn't been disgusting. My aunt shut him out for a while, his mom cried to my mom, and the family split into those who wanted to pretend it could be smoothed over and those who were too furious to tolerate excuses, and Derek found himself suddenly not invited to things, not welcomed, not celebrated, which for a guy who lived off attention was like starvation. Maya told me his real estate work started suffering too, because people don't like doing business with someone who's publicly known for betrayal, especially when his entire brand was trust and community values, and while I didn't take joy in his financial stress, I did feel a grim satisfaction in watching him realize that actions have wider ripples than he'd imagined. The divorce process was its own special kind of hell, because it forced me to reduce my heartbreak into forms and decisions, like checking boxes for custody schedules while still waking up some mornings with that punch of disbelief that this was my life. Lauren wanted to work it out until she realized I was serious, and then she pivoted to anger, accusing me of being cold, accusing me of turning the family against her, accusing me of caring more about pride than love, and I let her say it because arguing with someone who won't take accountability is like yelling into fog. The only time I raised my voice was when she hinted that I was keeping the kids from her, and I snapped that she could see them exactly as outlined in our temporary agreement and that I had done nothing but protect their stability, and she burst into tears again and said, "You're acting like I'm a monster," and I told her, "I'm acting like you made monstrous choices." Through it all, the kids became my compass, because every time I felt myself slipping into rage or despair, I looked at Ben and Ellie and reminded myself that they deserved at least one parent who didn't use them as emotional collateral. I got them into a child therapist who specialized in family changes, and I went too, because I didn't want to be the dad who pretends he's fine until he explodes years later. Ben asked me one night if Lauren and I were getting divorced, because of Uncle Derek, and my heart nearly stopped because I hadn't realized how much he'd absorbed, and I told him, carefully, that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and those choices change families, and that none of it was his fault, and he nodded like he understood more than he should at 9 years old. The moment that truly cemented the revenge plan Maya and I had talked about wasn't the family reveal itself, it was what happened after, because Derek and Lauren tried to crawl back into each other's arms publicly, like if they acted confident enough people would eventually accept it, and it backfired spectacularly. Derek posted a photo of him and Lauren at some trendy bar with a caption about new beginnings, and within hours, cousins and friends were texting me screenshots, furious on my behalf, disgusted on Maya's behalf, and Derek started receiving backlash in his own comments from people who knew the story, which made him delete the post and then lash out, calling everyone toxic. Lauren, meanwhile, discovered that being the other woman in a scandal isn't romantic, it's isolating. Because Derek didn't suddenly become a devoted partner, he became a panicked man scrambling to secure the one person who would still have him, and when the thrill wore off and the consequences set in, their relationship turned into a mutual blame pit. Maya told me Derek started pressuring Lauren for money because his commissions were drying up, and Lauren started pressuring Derek for emotional reassurance because her own life was collapsing, and they both started realizing they hadn't built anything real, they just burned down what we had. Within months, Derek had moved out of his condo into a cheaper place because he couldn't keep up the payments, and Lauren had to move into a small apartment because she couldn't afford the house and I wasn't about to let her stay there while I slept in the guest room like a punished dog. Watching them flail wasn't a sweet victory, it was more like watching a slow-motion car crash you tried to warn someone about, except they'd been the ones driving drunk and now they were shocked the road was unforgiving. The final collapse came when Derek cheated on Lauren too, which is so predictable it almost feels like a cliché, but reality doesn't care about originality. Lauren called me one night, sobbing, saying Derek had been messaging some girl, and I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood, listening to the woman who broke my heart cry because the man she broke it for had done the same to her, and I felt something complicated, not joy, not pity exactly, but this heavy confirmation that betrayal is a pattern, not a one-time accident. Lauren said, through tears, I thought he was different with me, and I almost laughed because of course she did, because cheaters always convince themselves they're the exception, that they're special, that the rules won't apply, and I told her, as calmly as I could, this is what you chose, and I'm sorry you're hurting, but I can't be the person who catches you anymore. That conversation was the last time I felt emotionally tangled with her, because after that, something finally loosened, like a knot that had been tightening for months snapped, and in that snap was freedom. The divorce finalized in the spring, and the custody arrangement became routine, and Lauren tried, at times, to rekindle some emotional connection, slipping into nostalgia and saying things like, remember when we used to, as if memory could override damage, and I stopped responding to that. I kept communication about the kids, logistics, and nothing else, and the more I did that, the more my life began to feel like mine again, not a constant reaction to her choices. Maya and I remained friends, which I know sounds strange, but it wasn't some messy rebound thing, it was two people who had been through a specific kind of hell and refused to pretend it hadn't changed them. We met for coffee occasionally, talked about school and work and the weirdness of rebuilding, and sometimes we'd vent about how Derek was still trying to posture online like he was thriving, which was almost funny now that we were on the other side of it. Maya eventually graduated nursing school, and she sent me a photo of her in her scrubs with this exhausted, proud smile, and I remember feeling genuinely happy for her, because she'd taken pain and still built something. As for me, the happily part didn't show up like fireworks, it showed up like quiet mornings where I made pancakes with the kids and nobody in the house was lying to me, it showed up like evenings where I sat on the porch with a beer and didn't feel dread in my chest, it showed up like therapy sessions where I stopped blaming myself for someone else's betrayal. I started taking better care of my body, not in some revenge glow-up way, but because stress had been eating me alive and I didn't want my kids growing up watching their dad crumble. I switched to a day shift eventually, not because Lauren deserved it but because my life deserved stability, and the first time I had a normal dinner schedule again, I realized how much the night shift had been a convenient cover for Lauren's secrecy, and I felt a deep, quiet relief that the structure of my days now belonged to me. Lauren's life, on the other hand, kept fracturing, because once the affair imploded, she didn't have the marriage to fall back on, she didn't have Derek as a stable partner, and she didn't have the family's trust, and she realized too late that she traded long-term safety for short-term thrill. She bounced between jobs because her reputation followed her in our community, she cycled through friendships that grew strained because people don't like being close to someone who treats loyalty like a suggestion, and her relationship with Derek became this toxic loop of blaming and reconciling until it finally died, leaving her alone with the choices she'd made. Watching that was sad in the broad human sense, because nobody roots for a person to self-destruct, but it was also the natural outcome of her decisions, and I stopped feeling responsible for cushioning her from that. If I have any reflection to offer, it's this: betrayal doesn't just hurt because of the act, it hurts because it rewrites your past without your consent, and the only way to reclaim yourself is to stop letting the betrayers write the story. For months, I kept thinking I needed closure, I needed an explanation that would make it make sense, I needed Lauren to say the exact right words that would let me file the pain neatly away, and what I learned is that closure doesn't come from them, it comes from you, from choosing not to live in the fog of their excuses. The truth was enough, the proof was enough, and the rest was just noise. If you're reading this and you're in something similar, my advice is simple but not easy: don't protect the people who didn't protect you, don't keep their secrets out of fear of conflict, and don't confuse forgiveness with surrender. Get your facts, get your legal footing, protect your kids, and lean on people who keep you grounded, even if those people come from unexpected places like the betrayed girlfriend of the man who blew up your life. Revenge doesn't have to be cruel or illegal to be effective, sometimes revenge is just refusing to be lied about, refusing to be manipulated, and building a life so steady and honest that the people who chose chaos can't stand next to it without feeling the weight of what they did. I didn't win because Lauren suffered, I won because I stopped bleeding for someone who wouldn't stop cutting me, and in the quiet moments now, when Ben is laughing in the back seat, when Ellie falls asleep with her head on my shoulder during a movie, when the house is peaceful and my phone isn't full of secrets, I realize that happiness after betrayal isn't a dramatic new chapter, it's the slow, stubborn act of choosing yourself every day until one day you wake up and the pain isn't the first thing you feel anymore.